Kamikaze is a poem which, at least at first glance, seems to have a very straightforward narrative. A pilot who is ordered to complete a suicide mission turns back, presumably because he remembers his family, and when he returns home, his family exclude him and shun him. By the end of the poem, he wonders which is the best way to die. While, as far as I can tell, Beatrice Garland has no personal connection with Japan, that wasn't her focus in writing the poem. She wanted to focus on the collective trauma as a result of being a survivor. Just like Poppies, this is a poem where the name, the title of the poem, carries all of the background. While personally I can't fully empathise with the collective trauma behind a defeat at war, what I can do is offer you the history behind the Kamikaze fighters and let you hear from some people who experienced being a survivor of this campaign. Through examining the history, we can work out quite a lot about the character of our pilot.
As the iron ring of Allied sea power closes round Japan, big American naval units carry the fight ever nearer to the home islands of Nippon. Planes return to their carriers. Some of them come in the hard way. Today, Japan is desperate. The American Pacific Fleet, backed by powerful British units, is taking fearful toll of enemy aircraft. Japan's answer is the use of a new weapon, Kamikaze. Suicide pilots who dive squarely into Allied ships to sink them. Japan's growing desperation is reflected in this fanatical sacrifice of pilots and aircraft in a crazy attempt.
Our pilot would have been young, probably in his late teens. Some Kamikaze were as young as 15, and the occasional pilot as old as 25, but most were around the age of today's year 12. Kozo Naoji, a survivor of the Kamikaze campaigns, believed that the pre-war exemptions from military service for students would keep him safe. He said, at the time of Pearl Harbor, I was only nearing the end of my second year at high school. The war was being fought by adults. Students were still deferred from the draft. If everything had gone normally, I wouldn't have graduated from university until March 1946. I was sure I was absolutely safe, and I acted that way. However, his school would endlessly have been promoting the idea of military sacrifice due to a change in government policy. There was also the traditional veneration of the emperor, Hirohito. Sato Hideo, who was in primary school during the Second World War, remembered that, throughout the war years, the emperor remained special. Our image of the emperor never flickered. I was repelled by the army, which I saw with my own eyes, but I never extended those thoughts to the great Field Marshal Emperor who existed in the inner recesses of that army. Whenever I saw a picture of the emperor riding his white horse, I gushed, how wonderful! We weren't even allowed to step on a newspaper that bore the emperor's image. We couldn't wrap up our lunch in such a paper because juice might leak on the emperor's face. Naturally, when the emperor himself sent orders down via the ranks of the military that he needed volunteers for suicide missions, in which a pilot would smash his plane, or a sailor his boat, into an American aircraft carrier, many young men did happily volunteer. Why would he ask this of people, though? One reason was practical. Japan was dramatically losing the war, suffering numerous defeats, and running very low on supplies after attempting to control China and fight America in the Pacific with few resources. From a purely logistical standpoint, it made sense. A trained pilot could destroy a potentially dangerous battleship, and it would cost one life and one plane. However, these campaigns had a hit rate of less than 20%. Even so, historians estimate that around 6,500 young men carried out these attacks. There's also an ideological reason why Hirohito would order his people to do this. He'd been brought up with what imperial families believed were the traditional virtues of Japan. one of which included extreme levels of loyalty. This is also one of the requirements given in the Bushido Code, the unwritten laws of Japan's ancient samurai warrior class. The Bushido Code states that the first duty of a samurai was loyalty to his lord. Japan had a feudal system in which a lord expected obedience from his vassals, who in turn received economic and military protection from the lord. If a lord couldn't count on absolute loyalty from his vassals, the entire system would have collapsed. This sense of loyalty and honour was often carried to extremes by the Japanese, who would fight to the death in a hopeless battle to protect their master's castle, or commit suicide if they felt they had disgraced their lord. It would therefore be entirely reasonable within this framework for the emperor to expect this kind of sacrifice from his people. The one-way ticket to history and the incantations mentioned in the poem have some basis in fact. Yokuta Yutaka was a young pilot when he heard his commander place a choice to become a kamikaze in front of him. The commander said, "Your motherland faces immediate peril. Consider how much your motherland needs you. Now a weapon which will destroy the enemy has been born. If there be any among you who burn with a passion to die gloriously for the sake of their country, let them step forward. Do not think of returning alive. These arms have not been selected in order that you may return alive." Yokuta Yutaka said in response, "When I was selected, I felt a slight sense of sadness. My life now had no more than a year to go. I was already on the base. I wasn't thinking of surviving the war. Rather than getting shot down by some plane, better than to die grandly. Go out in glory. We trained desperately. You couldn't complain of pain or anything. You had to push on. If I don't hit the target, if I have to self-detonate, I'll die without doing what I must." It was agony for everybody. Once you become a member of an attack force, you become deathly serious. Your eyes become set, focused. If you'd had 2 lives, it wouldn't have mattered, but you were giving up your only life. Life is so precious. Your life is dedicated to self-sacrifice, committed to smashing into the enemy. That's why we were trained like that. We practiced that hard because we valued our lives so highly. The morning of our departure from the base, we said farewell to life. We wore our dress uniforms. They gave us each a short sword and a headband marked with the words, "Given 7 lives, I'll serve my nation with each of them." There is an old expression, Bushido is the search for a place to die. Well, that was our fervent desire, our long-cherished dream. A place to die for my country. I was happy to have been born a man of Japan. I don't care if that makes me sound egotistical, but that's how I felt. The country was in my hands. Now the pilot in Kamikaze turns back, and it's implied that he does this because he remembers his family. However, not many survivors took that course of action. Most were saved from having to carry out their mission by Japan's surrender at the end of the war. One who did turn back was Ryuji Nagatsuka, but not quite in the way described in the poem, though in his account he also mentions the cairn of stones which is in the poem. In his autobiography he said, "We continued flying in tight formation. Visibility is very poor. I keep my eyes glued to the flight leader's plane. The rising sun painted on his fuselage in the form of a red circle is veiled now and then by light cloud, which also hides the other planes from me. With their green and white patches, these fighters have a somewhat sorrowful air. In the sunshine, they might have been compared to the swift little birds of heaven, but at this moment in their camouflage, they make me think of monstrous birds of hell. In spite of their speed, they look as if they are hanging motionless in the sky. A curious image comes to mind, a dead samurai, seen in a film when I was a child. Exposed to the glacial winds on the foggy and deserted banks of the River Styx, he has done his best to build a pile of stones, but the invisible demons of hell there downed his cairn before it could reach the required height. According to Buddhist legend, a dead man must construct a cairn of stones to gain the eternal repose of his soul. A virtuous soul will do it without difficulty. A man who has lived in vice will never succeed, for the demons will never let him. The sea below me is rough and grey. The high white waves are like fabulous beasts showing their teeth. But at least this is a manifestation of nature, of life. And when I consider that soon I shall have no contact with these things, I feel the angry swell and the foam pleasing to my eye. I feel a profound attachment to life surging up anew within me, lacerating my heart as death approaches me. I long to cry out, "Why me? Why must I die?" when my fellow students are allowed to live and will be able to continue their studies. There is no answer, no solution. Man is too weak to accept an accomplished fact without regret. Suddenly, my commander points to the rear. God, there must be American planes pursuing us. I turn round. Nothing but thick cloud. I can't understand the leader's signal. A few seconds later, the commander swings his plane round to the left. What, is he turning back? At that moment, I see the second and third planes swinging round obediently. My left foot presses the rubber pedal and my hand automatically tips the stick to change course. If we keep on flying through this cotton wool, it will mean throwing our lives away for nothing. Our flight leader must have reasoned it all out. I choke back my tears. No doubt my comrades are in the same state. When our narrator Nagatsuka landed safely, his commander's reaction fitted the stereotype that would be expected and is presented in our poem. The commander said, "Why did you turn back? Don't you realise what punishments and humiliations will be waiting for you at the base? The ground crews, even the schoolboys, will look at you coldly." However, before Nagatsuka was punished, the war ended, and he was free to return home. His family were very much pleased to see him. The reaction of the pilot's family in Kamikaze, when the writer states that my mother never spoke again in his presence, seems to be the point where the narrative of the poem turns away from most recorded experiences. The reaction which families would give the pilots who were able to avoid death seems to be mostly relief and happiness. Another pilot, Tatsuzo Nishimura's family, gave him a typical welcome when he returned home. What awaited Nishimura instead of shame were the faces of his parents, older brother and younger sister. Nishimura felt neither regret nor happiness, but rather thought, if only we'd been able to fight, maybe we'd have won. His family was happy to finally have him return safe, though. Nishimura ended up becoming a carpenter like his father, married with 2 children. He said later, if we had the chance to complete our mission, this day would never have come. He stayed working into his 70s, and his greatest joy was watching over his grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. Despite the happy lives led by some real-life pilots, by the end of the poem, our pilot wonders which was the better way to die, which expresses the regret and trauma that lies at the heart of the poem. It's impossible to lump all survivors' experiences together to make a simple answer as to whether this would be plausible. Each survivor would react differently. However, one who did later express the kind of sadness and regret shown by our pilot was one of the men tasked with allocating pilots to suicide missions on gliders instead of planes with bombs attached. This was known as Oka. The job of overseeing and training Oka pilots and ultimately sending them to certain death fell to Fujio Hayashi, who was 22 at the time. Mr. Hayashi believes that Oka might never have happened if there'd been no volunteers when the concept was first suggested. He was one of the first 2 volunteers for Oka, dozens followed, but he could never stop blaming himself, wondering whether his early backing helped bring it about. When he finally saw one of the flimsy gliders, he felt duped, Many thought it looked like a joke. Over the decades, Hayashi was tormented by guilt at having sent dozens of young men to their deaths with my pencil, as he put it, referring to how he had written the names for OCAR assignments each day. To squelch any suspicion of favouritism, he sent his favourite pilots first. After the war, Hayashi joined the military and attended memorials for the dead pilots. He consoled families and told everyone how gentle the men had been. They smiled right up till their deaths, he said, because they didn't want anyone to mourn or worry. Every day, 365 days a year, whenever I remember those who died, tears start coming. I have to run into the bathroom and weep. While I'm there weeping, I feel they're vibrantly alive in my heart, just the way they were long ago, he wrote later. Hayashi hardly talked about his kamikaze days to his children. They remember him as a dad who loved classical music, who took them to amusement parks and loved cats so much he adopted strays. I think of the many men I killed with my pencil and I apologise for having killed them in vain, he said. He often said he wanted his ashes to be scattered in the sea near the southern islands of Okinawa where his men had died. Until then, he said, his war would never be over. So, there you have it. This is a poem about loss, regret, dealing with memories within families and within a culture. I hope you've enjoyed reading it and teaching it as much as I have over the years.